In this section, I cover all the basic footwork that is required for both attacking and defending against attacks. The majority of the movements are not overly complex. The difficult part is not breaking your stance as you execute them. More specifically, you don't want to drop your hands, spread your feet too far apart, or do anything that will compromise your stance. To begin, start with the simple steps, such as side steps, forward and backward steps, and switching your stance. Once you get the hang of them, move on to pivot steps. The goal in this section is to get an introduction to the movements that you'll be using later in the DVD to set up attacks and counterattacks. Instead of rushing through this section, take your time with it. Work on developing each technique and then work on putting them together. Learning the side step may take just a few seconds, but it gets a little more complex when you combine it with a pivot. There are an infinite number of footwork combinations that you can put together, and the more you master, the more dangerous you become. While your stance is your foundation, your footwork is your ground floor. In this sequence, I demonstrate basic footwork. I show the side step, forward step, and back step movements, all of which can be utilized to initiate an attack or evade one of your opponent's attacks. They can also be combined with more complex movements, such as the shuffle step or pivot step. As a rule of thumb, always lead with the foot closest to the direction you want to head. If you have your left foot in front and want to step forward, move your left foot first. If you want to step to your right, step your right foot first. And if you want to move to your left, step your left foot first. Unless you're setting up a specific technique, never cross your feet. If you do, your balance will be compromised and your body will be open to attack. It is also important to maintain a tight stance as you move about. Keep your hands up at chin level and your elbows tucked to your sides. This will put you in a prime position to either attack or defend on a moment's notice. Lastly, never let your feet get too spread apart. To maintain a balanced stance, take small steps and immediately drag your trailing leg forward. Again, this will ensure that you are always ready to attack or defend. In this sequence, I demonstrate a shuffle step, which is a good technique to employ to cover a lot of distance in a hurry without breaking your stance. The forward shuffle step is generally used to set up an attack, and the backward shuffle step is generally used to evade one of your opponent's attacks. Just as with general movement, you always want to lead with the foot closest to the direction you want to head. It is also important to maintain your stance throughout the movement. You want to keep your feet roughly a shoulder widths apart. If they come too close together or spread too far apart, your balance will be compromised, which gives your opponent an opportunity to attack. Avoid picking your feet up off the mat as you shuffle. Instead, slide them across the mat. This will prevent your opponent from launching an attack while you are in the air, as well as quickly put you in a position to attack or defend. To execute a forward switch step, all you have to do is step your rear foot forward. If you're in a standard fighting stance, step your right foot in front of your left. If you're in a southpaw stance, step your left foot in front of your right. Although it is an extremely simple technique, it can prove invaluable when hunting down a retreating opponent or while in the middle of a striking combination. By switching your stance, you create different angles of attack and force your opponent to adjust to your new positioning. The backward switch step is the same as the forward switch step in that you reverse the positioning of your feet to assume an opposite fighting stance, but instead of stepping your rear foot forward, you step your lead foot back. This technique is best utilized when retreating after an attack or countering your opponent's forward movement. Just as with the shuffle step, do not elevate your feet off the mat. Instead, slide them across the mat into their new position. It is also important to keep your feet positioned roughly a shoulder width apart to maintain a solid base. sidestep to inside pivot can prove useful in several scenarios. For example, if you're in a southpaw stance and your opponent circles towards the outside of your lead foot, executing a sidestep can keep your hips aligned with his and prevent him from obtaining a dominant angle of attack. If he changes directions and begins circling towards the inside of your lead leg, executing an inside pivot again allows you to keep your hips square with his hips. By utilizing this simple technique, you can keep your opponent in front of you with minimal movement. The sidestep to inside pivot can also be used as an attack. For example, you may advance on your opponent's center line with a series of strikes and then execute a sidestep to inside pivot to acquire a more dominant angle of attack. As with all the footwork techniques shown in this section, I recommend practicing the movements while shadowboxing and sparring as much as possible. To perform the inside pivot, I take a small outward step with my lead foot, shift my weight onto my lead leg, and then slide my rear foot circularly along the mat. A common mistake a lot of fighters make is they slide their foot first and then rotate their upper body, which compromises their balance. Instead, you want to move your entire body as a single unit. The outside pivot is similar to the inside pivot, but instead of acquiring a dominant angle on your opponent's right side, you acquire a dominant angle on his left side. As you will learn later in the DVD, there are many situations in which this technique proves useful. For example, if your opponent is circling towards your left side, executing an outside pivot allows you to square your hips with his hips, eliminating his dominant angle of attack. The primary difference between the inside pivot and the outside pivot is the direction in which you rotate. With my left foot forward, I slide my rear leg in a clockwise direction to execute an inside pivot, and slide it in a counterclockwise direction to execute an outside pivot. In this section, I teach all the punching techniques that I use in mixed martial arts. No matter which punch you throw, you want to keep your striking arm relaxed and generate power using your legs, hips, and the rotation of your shoulders. If you have any tension in your arm, you will not only lose power and speed, but you'll also burn precious energy. It is also very important to immediately bring your striking arm back into your stance after landing a punch. A lot of fighters have the bad habit of dropping their arm as they bring it back toward their body, but if you're up against a good counterpuncher, this is an excellent way to get knocked out. To avoid breaking your hand, which is quite common in MMA due to the small gloves worn by the fighters, you always want to strike your target using only the knuckles of your index and middle fingers. To protect your face from counter strikes, always keep your free arm elevated. When studying the moves, pay special attention to how each one is best utilized. Some punches are more applicable as a lead-in attack, some work better as a secondary attack, and some are most effective as a counter attack. Later in the DVD, I will demonstrate how to string various punches together to form combinations, as well as show you how to use the various punches to counter your opponent's attacks. But in the beginning, it is best to focus on form and learn the function of each strike. The straight jab is one of the most important punches in mixed martial arts competition. It can be used to set up kicks, takedowns, and power punches. It can be used to close the distance between you and your opponent and establish a clinch. It's a phenomenal counterpunch, and it's also a phenomenal tool for preventing your opponent from bull rushing into your comfort zone. And unlike boxing, you can cause a healthy amount of damage with a single jab due to the small gloves worn by MMA combatants. If your goal is to have dangerous hands, I strongly suggest spending an ample amount of time developing this highly versatile punch and then exploring its various uses. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to throw a straight jab from your stance, but it is important to mention that it can also be coupled with a step forward, a step backward, or even a sidestep to achieve a variety of goals. To throw the jab, I do several things in succession. 1. I keep my right hand glued to the side of my face. 2. I drive my left shoulder upward to protect the left side of my jaw. 3. I drive off my rear foot to generate more power behind the strike. 4. I extend my left arm straight out, rotating my fist so that the palm is facing the mat. 5. When I strike my target, I do so with the first 2 knuckles of my left hand. The straight cross is one of the most feared weapons in mixed martial arts competition. When a competitor has mastered this strike, you'll often hear the commentators making such remarks as, if he connects with his straight cross, the fight will be over. Landing a powerful cross to one of your opponent's vulnerable areas causes damage, plain and simple. But developing speed, power, and accuracy in your crosses doesn't happen overnight. It also takes a considerable amount of time to learn how to properly set up your crosses. In this sequence, I demonstrate the traditional right cross. In this version, the cross is thrown directly from your stance and is best utilized when you're already within striking distance of your opponent. To throw the cross from my orthodox stance, I rotate my hips in a counterclockwise direction, come up onto the ball of my right foot, and throw my right fist straight out. As my fist nears its target, I turn my hand over so that my palm is facing the mat. Just as with the jab, I connect with the first 2 knuckles of my hand. When thrown correctly, the lead hook can be a very powerful punch, and because it approaches your target from the side rather than from straight on, it can also be a very difficult punch for your opponent to evade. Unlike straight punches, which can be slipped, the only way to avoid a hook is to move out of the way or duck underneath of the punch, neither of which are easy to manage. Your opponent always has the option of blocking your lead hook with his arm, but it's not a very reliable option. Due to the small gloves worn in MMA and the circular path of the strike, your fist will often slip past his arm and connect with the side of his face. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to throw a standard lead hook, which is best employed when you're roughly an arm's length away from your opponent. To execute this punch, I do several things in succession. 1. Keep my right hand glued to the right side of my face for protection. 2. Rotate my hips and shoulders in a clockwise direction. 3. Extend my left arm outward along a circular path. 4. Pivot on the ball of my left foot and rotate my fist so that my palm is facing the mat. 5. Strike my target with the knuckles of my index and middle fingers. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to throw a mid-range lead hook. It is thrown exactly the same as the long-range hook, except instead of elongating your striking arm forward as you throw the hook, you put more of a bend into your arm. If you look at my footwork, you'll notice that with some of the hooks, I pivot my lead foot as I did when throwing the long-range hook, and others, I keep my lead foot planted on the mat. This is a matter of preference. Pivoting your lead foot allows you to deliver a more snappy punch, thereby causing more damage, but throwing a lead hook with your foot planted allows you to employ a more pushing punch, which proves useful to off-balance your opponent and push him into a follow-up strike, such as a rear round kick. It is also important to notice that with some punches I turn my fist over so that my palm is facing the mat, and with others I keep my palm facing my body. Again, this is a matter of preference. To execute this technique, I do several things in succession. 1. I keep my right hand glued to the right side of my face for protection. 2. Rotate my hips and shoulders in a clockwise direction. 3. Extend my left arm outward along the circular path. 4. Pivot on the ball of my left foot and rotate my fist so that my palm is facing the mat. 5. Strike my target with the knuckles of my index and middle fingers. sequence, I demonstrate the close range lead hook, which is best employed when in clinching range with your opponent. In order to land the strike, you must have an even bigger bend in your arm than when throwing the mid-range lead hook. Again, you do not want to wind your entire body up for the strike. Instead, you want to utilize a quick snapping motion that sends your lead fist into the side of your opponent's jaw. Due to range, I do not turn my fist over when throwing this punch. However, I still strike my target using the first two knuckles of my hand. Personally, I like to use the close range hook to get my opponent to back up and then land a more definitive mid-range hook. There are two primary ways to throw a lead uppercut. The first is a lead standard uppercut, which involves throwing the punch directly from your stance. It doesn't pack that much power, but it's a quick and elusive strike. In this sequence, I demonstrate the lead power uppercut. Before throwing the punch in this version, execute a slip by rotating your body and dropping your level. It's not as stealthy, but it packs a lot of power and is an excellent technique for slipping and countering one of your opponent's straight punches. Due to the dynamics of this punch, it is best utilized when in close range and middle range with your opponent. To pull this technique off, I do several things sequentially. 1. Coming up onto the ball of my rear foot, I drop my lead shoulder to generate power for the punch. This moves my head away from my center line, which would allow me to avoid a straight punch directed at my face. 2. Pulling my right shoulder back, I whip my hips in a clockwise direction, rotate my hand so that my palm is facing me, and throw my fist upward. To protect my face, I keep my opposite hand up. 3. I continue to rotate my body in a clockwise direction until my fist collides with my target. If you miss your strike or are shadowboxing in the gym, your fist should not come up past eye level. Just as with the lead uppercut, there are two primary ways to throw the rear uppercut. The first method is the standard rear uppercut, which I show here. It's a fast and sneaky punch because it is thrown directly from your stance. The second method is the power rear uppercut, which involves slipping to the outside of your opponent's body prior to throwing the punch. It can cause a lot of damage, but it is easier for your opponent to read due to the added movements. To execute the rear standard uppercut, I do several things simultaneously. 1. I pivot on the ball of my rear foot and rotate my hips in a counterclockwise direction. 2. I pull my left shoulder back, drop my right shoulder, and lower my right fist. 3. Continuing to pull my left shoulder back, I rotate my right hand so that my palm is facing me and throw my fist upward into my target. Notice how I have kept my left arm up to protect the left side of my face. The overhand is responsible for putting countless fighters to sleep in mixed martial arts competition. The mechanics of the punch is similar to a straight cross, but instead of throwing your fist straight out, you drop your opposite shoulder and extend your arm forward in a downward arc, similar to a swimmer's freestyle stroke. Due to its arcing trajectory, your opponent can't slip the strike by moving his head away from his center line, as can be done with straight punches. He can block the overhand with his arm, but it's not a very good option. If your hand slips through a crack in his protective shield, he will most likely go to sleep. And even when he manages to absorb the full impact with his arm, the power the overhand possesses will still cause him damage. Your opponent's best option when you throw the overhand is to quickly get out of the way, but by perfecting your timing and learning how to set up the strike, you can make that a difficult chore. To execute the overhand, I do several things sequentially. 1. Keeping my left hand up for protection, I come up onto the ball of my right foot, rotate my hips and shoulders in a counterclockwise direction, and slightly dip my left shoulder toward my left side. 2. I slightly shift my weight forward. 3. As I rotate my body and dip my left shoulder toward my left side, I connect with the side of my opponent's face using the knuckles of my index and middle fingers. To protect myself from counterpunches, I've not only shrugged my right shoulder and kept my left hand guarding my face, but I've also kept my head up and my eyes locked onto my opponent. If you drop your head or look at the mat, your ability to effectively follow up the overhand with another strike will decrease. This is an excellent technique to utilize when your opponent is injured or you can see that his face is vulnerable to strikes, but he has created distance between your bodies to avoid your strikes. To close the distance, you step your rear foot forward, and to deliver a powerful strike, you throw a cross while in mid-step. With your body moving forward, the cross has a lot more power than it does when thrown directly from your stance. Whether your opponent blocks the strike or gets hit, his most natural reaction will be to retreat backwards. To capitalize on that retreat, you step your rear leg forward again and throw another cross while in mid-step, which switches you back to your original stance. When your opponent is injured, it's possible to hit him with 3 punches in a row, but I don't recommend chasing him all the way across the ring using this technique. There's a good chance he will gather his senses and switch his linear movement to a side-to-side movement. This will cause you to move past your opponent, making you vulnerable to counter-strikes. So, I suggest practicing throwing 3 stepping crosses in a row, no more. This is the same technique as demonstrated in the previous sequence, only now you're using it as a counter. As your opponent charges towards you, you step your lead leg behind you and throw a jab while in mid-step. If your opponent continues forward, you repeat the process again on the other side to return to your initial fighting stance. However, it is important to notice that in this sequence, I only employ 2-step punches rather than 3. The instant you begin moving backwards, your opponent will most likely think you are on the run and increase his forward momentum. If you employ more than 2 back steps, he will often be able to overrun you and either land hard strikes or execute a takedown. To prevent this from happening, I like to execute 2 back step punches to get my opponent to commit to his forward charge, and then utilize a pivot step to reposition my body off to my opponent's side. This causes his body to move past me, giving me a dominant angle of attack. When I fought Chris Lieben in the UFC, I used this exact technique as he rushed towards me with a series of punches. Instead of trying to hold my ground and dodge his strikes, I stepped back and threw punches. With all his momentum moving forward, my strikes landed considerably harder than they would have if he had remained stationary. In this section, you will not only learn how to parry your opponent's punches, but also use parries to launch a counter-strike. While a parry is a rather simple movement to execute, it requires tremendous timing and a sense of distance. For example, if your opponent throws a punch from just outside of punching range, it's possible to simply parry the punch by catching it in your palm. This requires very little movement on your part, and, if you have superior reach, allows you to immediately land a counterpunch. However, if your opponent throws a punch from inside of punching range or has a longer reach, you must use the parry to move his fist to the outside of your head in order to avoid his shot and land a counterstrike. In order to acquire this timing and a proper sense of distance, I recommend doing parrying drills as much as possible with different partners. Rear parry is a hand block that can be used to catch or redirect your opponent's straight punches. As far as movement is concerned, it's a fairly simple technique. The goal is to catch your opponent's fist in the palm of your hand as his arm reaches the end of its extension and redirect it to the outside of your head. The most difficult part is acquiring the proper sense of distance. If your opponent is just inside of punching range and he throws a straight jab at your face, catching his fist in your palm is enough to prevent his fist from connecting with its target. If your opponent is well inside of punching range when he throws the jab, you want to combine the rear parry with a slight slip. This is accomplished by using your rear hand to redirect his strike towards the outside of your head, while at the same time slipping your head towards the outside of his striking arm. Although the parry is a simple technique to understand, the only way to develop the proper sense of distance is through countless hours of drilling and sparring. I strongly suggest you invest that time because mastering this highly effective counter tactic is mandatory for becoming a proficient striker. In this sequence, I use a rear parry to evade my opponent's jab just as in the last sequence, but before he can pull his arm back into his stance, I counter with a jab of my own. There are two ways to pull this off. In this scenario, my opponent throws his jab from just inside punching range. As a result, instead of parrying his fist to the outside of my head, I simply catch it in my rear palm. However, if my opponent had a superior reach or threw his jab from well inside punching range, then I would need to parry his hand to the outside of my head and slip my head off my center line to avoid his shot. Either way, it is important to counter with the jab before your opponent can pull his arm back into his stance. I recommend practicing this technique as much as possible, both on the focus mitts and with a live partner. It is important to mention that when using the rear parry, you never want to reach your hand towards your opponent's punch. If you get into this bad habit, there is a chance your opponent will pick up on it. To break your guard, all he has to do is throw a fake punch. As your hand rockets forward, he pulls his hand back. Suddenly, your face is exposed and vulnerable, allowing him to target it with other punches. To prevent such an outcome, move your hand in front of your face and let the punch come to it instead of the other way around. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to parry your opponent's jab using your rear hand and then follow up with a counter cross. The primary difference here is that instead of parrying my opponent's fist to the outside of my head, I use my rear hand to parry his fist downward. Not only does this redirect his punch and zap its power, but it also creates a pathway for me to throw my parrying hand over his arm and land across. It is important to notice that I am not parrying his punch, pulling my hand back into my stance, and then throwing the cross. I throw the cross immediately after parrying his fist downward. If you hesitate between these two actions, your opponent will be able to pull his arm back into his stance to protect his face. In previous sequences, I demonstrated how to utilize a rear parry to evade your opponent's jab when in the same fighting stance, meaning you have the same foot forward. When you and your opponent have the opposite feet forward, the rear parry is utilized to evade a cross. Everything is done the same. The only difference is that you're parrying his rear arm instead of his lead arm. And just as when parrying the jab, you have the option of redirecting your opponent's fist to the outside of your head, which allows you to quickly counter with a jab, or redirecting it downward, which allows you to immediately throw a cross with your parrying hand. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to evade your opponent's cross using a lead parry when in the same fighting stance. To accomplish this, I simply redirect my opponent's fist away from my face, causing him to miss. Just as with all parries, it is important not to reach for your opponent's fist. Instead, you want to let his fist come to your hand. opponent and I are in the same fighting stance, and he throws a cross at my face. To evade his cross, I utilize a lead parry. However, instead of redirecting his fist to the outside of my face, I stuff it downward. Not only does this zap the power from his punch, but it also lowers his arm and creates a pathway for me to counter with a jab. It is important to notice that I do not pull my arm back into my stance after executing the parry. I immediately lash out with a jab. If you delay, a couple of things can happen. Either your opponent will pull his arm back into his stance to protect his face from your counter strike, or he will follow up with another strike. To perfect this technique, practice it with a partner as a drill for several minutes at a time. My opponent and I are in the same fighting stance, and I use a lead parry to evade his jab. This is a slightly more dangerous technique because instead of your action repositioning your head to the outside of your opponent's arm, it repositions your head to the inside of his arm, which makes you very vulnerable to the cross. To mitigate the risk, I immediately execute a counter jab with my parry arm. If your opponent plans to throw a jab-cross combination, which is very common, the goal is to hit him with the jab before he can send the cross out of the chamber. Not only does this hinder him from throwing the cross, but it also disrupts his rhythm, allowing you to follow your jab with more strikes. However, if you delay between the parry and throwing the jab, there is a very good chance that you will eat a secondary punch. To avoid taking damage when first starting out, I recommend always parrying with the hand opposite to the one your opponent throws. If he throws a punch with his left hand, parry it with your right hand. If he throws a punch with his right hand, parry it with your left hand. This will take you to the outside of your opponent's body and limit his ability to hit you with a secondary strike. Only after you become comfortable with this should you incorporate more advanced techniques like the one demonstrated here. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to utilize a lead parry to evade your opponent's jab when in opposite fighting stances. It is important to notice that this technique follows the general rule. My opponent throws a punch with his right hand and I parry with my left, making it a lot safer of a technique than the previous one shown. It is also important to notice that instead of parrying his punch to the outside of my body, I force it downward. Again, this zaps power from his punch and also creates a pathway to throw my parrying hand over his arm and land a jab to his face. If you delay between the parry and the punch, your opponent will pull his arm back and re-establish his guard. When your opponent attacks, it's best to evade his strike and counter with a strike of your own. For example, your opponent throws a jab, and you counter by slipping his jab and throwing a jab at the same time. If done correctly, just as your opponent's arm becomes fully extended, you crash your fist into his face. In addition to avoiding some pain and dishing some out, striking your opponent while he's in the middle of his attack breaks his rhythm, making it very difficult for him to follow up with more strikes. This allows you to go on the offensive. However, you won't always have the foot positioning needed to evade all of your opponent's strikes, making it very important to learn how to block. It can be a little risky because even when you manage to cover your head with your arms, there will still be gaps in your protective shield, and sometimes the small MMA gloves will find their way through these cracks and connect with your face or head. For this reason, it is important to use blocking as a last option. The outside block is best used to combat punches that approach from the outside, such as hooks and overhands. It's a relatively simple block in terms of movement, and when executed with the proper form and correct timing, it can effectively protect your head from strikes. but due to the small gloves used in MMA competition, it can oftentimes be risky. It's not uncommon for a punch to slip through a crevice in your protective shield and crash into the side of your face, and even when you utilize a perfect outside block, you're still absorbing the impact of the blow. A much better option is to slip or evade the strike altogether and position yourself to launch a counterattack. However, evading punches isn't always possible, especially when you're trading punches with your opponent. If slipping isn't an alternative, utilizing the outside block is certainly better than letting your opponent hit you. To execute this technique, it is important to have proper form. As my opponent throws an overhand right at the side of my head, I immediately rotate my hips and shoulders in a clockwise direction, place my left hand on the back of my left ear, and elevate my left shoulder. This causes the power of my opponent's punch to be absorbed by my left forearm and shoulder. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to execute a rear outside block. If you and your opponent are in the same fighting stance, it's best utilized to defend against his lead hook. And if you are in opposite fighting stances, it's best used to defend against his rear hook or overhand. To execute this block, I rotate my body slightly in a counterclockwise direction, place my right hand behind my right ear, and elevate my right shoulder. This causes the power of my opponent's punch to be absorbed by my right forearm and shoulder. Again, it is always better to evade your opponent's strikes, but when not possible, blocking is better than taking a hard hit to the face. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to use a lead elbow parry to block your opponent's cross. To pull this technique off, as my opponent's fist comes at me, I rotate my shoulders in a clockwise direction, drop my left hand towards my solar plexus, and sweep my left elbow across my body to deflect my opponent's punch. To ensure my head is protected, I reach my right hand towards the left side of my head so that my forearm is stretched across my chin. While parrying is more effective for positioning your body for a counter-strike, the lead elbow parry is an excellent technique to employ when you don't have excellent foot positioning or your opponent catches you off guard. However, before executing this technique, you must be certain that your opponent's punch is aimed at your head. By elevating your elbows, you make your midsection vulnerable to liver and kidney punches. It is also not wise to utilize the lead elbow parry too often because your opponent might begin tailoring his combinations to this defense. For example, he might throw a cross to get you to elevate your elbows and then follow up with a lead round kick to your liver. As I have mentioned, it's always wise to position yourself to the outside of your opponent's punching arm because it limits your chances of getting hit with a secondary strike. In this sequence, my opponent throws a jab. Instead of blocking his punch with a lead elbow parry, which would position me to the inside of his punching arm, I execute a rear elbow parry. To pull this off, I rotate my body in a counterclockwise direction, drop my right hand towards my solar plexus, and sweep my right elbow across my body to deflect my opponent's fist. To ensure my head is protected, I reach my left hand towards the right side of my head so that my forearm is stretched across my chin. Now that you understand how to parry and block your opponent's punches, I demonstrate how to avoid them altogether utilizing evasive movements such as the inside slip, outside slip, lean back, and shoulder roll. As you will see, utilizing proper evasive techniques not only allows you to defend against your opponent's attacks, but it also provides you with a dominant angle to launch an attack. While parries and blocks are both necessary to have in your arsenal, perfecting evasive movements can make you a master striker. Inside slip is best utilized for evading straight punches such as the jab and cross. The movement involved is very similar to dropping into a low stance in that you lower your elevation by bending at the knees and sink your hips back, but instead of keeping your head centered, you move it away from your center line by bending at the waist and tilting your upper body. Deciding when to use the inside slip can be a little tricky. If you have the same stance as your opponent, meaning the same foot forward, the inside slip can be used to evade his jab. If you have the opposite stance, the inside slip can be used to evade his cross. In both cases, it is important to keep your back straight and your hands up. This will protect you from other strikes in his combination and position you to launch counterattacks. As I mentioned in the previous sequence, when in the same fighting stance as your opponent, the inside slip is best utilized to evade his jab. To pull this off, I sink my hips back, lower my elevation by bending at the knees, and dip my head towards my right side. Due to these actions, my opponent's punch sails past the side of my head. As I already mentioned, when in the opposite fighting stance as your opponent, the inside slip is best utilized to evade his cross. To pull this off, as my opponent's cross extends towards me, I begin rotating my shoulders in a clockwise direction and sink my hips back. Next, I lower my elevation by bending at the knees and dropping my head towards my right side. Due to my actions, his punch sails past the side of my head. If you've spent some time practicing the techniques I've already demonstrated, you should be quite familiar with the jab. You understand how to throw a jab, and you understand how to evade your opponent's jab using either a slip or a parry. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to blend jab offense and jab defense together. To accomplish this, all you have to do is slip your opponent's jab and throw a jab of your own at the same time. It is important to notice that I land my jab just as my opponent's jab arm reaches the end of its extension. This is key because when you hit an opponent while he is in the middle of a strike, it disrupts his rhythm, which in turn creates openings for you to follow up with a secondary attack. Opponent's combination and allow you to launch counterattacks. Straight punches. Like the inside slip, the outside slip allows you to evade a strike by moving your head away from your center line. However, instead of repositioning your head by dropping your level, sinking your hips, and bending your knees, you accomplish the goal by rotating your body and tilting your head in the direction of your lead leg. Once again, the stance that you and your opponent have will determine which strikes you can evade using the outside slip. For example, if you and your opponent are in opposite stances, the outside slip can be used to evade his jab. If you are in the same stance, the outside slip can be used to evade his cross. No matter what strike you use the outside slip to evade, it is important that you keep your hands up at face level. This will help protect you from other strikes in your opponent's combination and allow you to launch counterattacks. To execute this technique with an opponent in the same fighting stance, as his cross comes at me, I pivot on the ball of my right foot, rotate my hips and shoulders in a counterclockwise direction, and dip my head towards my left side. Due to these actions, my opponent's cross sails by the side of my head. As mentioned in the previous sequence, when you and your opponent are in opposite fighting stances, the outside slip is best utilized to evade his jab. The actual slip is exactly the same. As my opponent's fist comes at me, I pivot on the ball of my right foot, rotate my hips and shoulders in a counterclockwise direction, and dip my head towards my left side. Just as before, my actions put my head to the outside of his striking arm and causes his fist to sail by the side of my head. In this sequence, my opponent and I are in the same fighting stance, and he throws a cross at my face. Just as before, I execute an outside slip by pivoting on the ball of my right foot, rotating my hips and shoulders in a counterclockwise direction, and dipping my head toward my left side. However, as I execute the outside slip, I fire a right cross off at the same time. This is an excellent combination because the movement involved in the outside slip is the exact movement you make when throwing a cross. The two work flawlessly together. The goal is to hit your opponent as his arm reaches its full extension. If you wait until he pulls his arm back into his stance before throwing the cross, there is a good chance that he will block it. Striking him with his arm extended will break his rhythm, which not only makes it difficult for him to throw a secondary strike, but also allow you to launch a combination. The goal in any fight is to be as elusive as possible, and mastering both the inside and outside slip is an excellent way to achieve that. In this sequence, I demonstrate a continuous slipping drill, which allows you to evade your opponent's jabs and cross. Although it is important to practice drills such as these to ingrain specific movements into your mind, in a fight you never want to slip more than a couple of punches in a row without firing back. It doesn't matter how good of a fighter you are. If you utilize only defensive movements, eventually your opponent will pick up on the pattern and find his mark. You must always threaten your opponent. For the best results, I recommend practicing this drill from the same fighting stance as your opponent as well as from an opposite fighting stance. In this sequence, I'm demonstrating the inside shoulder roll, which is a defensive technique used in boxing. To execute the technique, I shift my weight onto my right leg, rotate my hips in a clockwise direction, pivot on the ball of my left foot, and roll my left shoulder toward my right side. The clockwise rotation is very important because it's what positions my lead shoulder in front of my face, protecting it from strikes. The goal with this technique is to move your head off of your center line and replace it with your lead shoulder, throwing off your opponent's targeting. It also blades your body, limiting his frontal targets. In the next sequence, I demonstrate how to put the shoulder roll into effect. this sequence, I demonstrate how to use an inside shoulder roll to defend against your opponent's jab when in the same fighting stance. As my opponent's fist comes at me, I shift my weight onto my right leg, rotate my hips in a clockwise direction, pivot on the ball of my left foot, and roll my left shoulder toward my right side. Notice how these actions move my head away from my center line and replaces it with my shoulder, causing my opponent to either miss his strike or hit my deltoid. However, it is important to mention that sometimes the shoulder roll alone is not enough to defend against your opponent's strikes. It's most effective when combined with other defense, such as elbow parries, hand parries, blocks, slips, or footwork. In this sequence, I drop my lead hand to protect my body and leave my rear hand high to better protect my head. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to use the inside shoulder roll to defend against your opponent's cross when in the same fighting stance. All my movements remain the same. The only difference is the punch that I'm using the shoulder roll to avoid. It is important to notice that when using the inside shoulder roll to evade the cross, I am positioned to the inside of my opponent's body, which makes me vulnerable to other strikes. And with my back slightly turned away from my opponent, I am vulnerable to takedowns. However, it is also important to notice that when executing the shoulder roll, my hips are spring-loaded, which allows me to deliver a powerful rear uppercut. I can use this uppercut to prevent my opponent from throwing a secondary strike, and I can also use it if my opponent should drop his elevation and shoot in for a takedown. To pull the lean back off, as my opponent's fist approaches my face, I take a backward step with my rear foot and lean my upper body backwards. It is important that I do not lean my head beyond my rear foot. This would disrupt my balance, making me vulnerable to both strikes and takedowns. The lean back is designed to immediately launch a counter strike, but in the beginning, it is important to drill just the lean back to get a feeling for measuring your opponent's range. Some fighters have a longer reach than others, and with this technique requiring you to be extremely close to your opponent's advancing fist, you must know the exact extension of his arm. For this reason, it's usually best to reserve the lean back until the later rounds of a fight, because by then you will have gauged the length of your opponent's arms. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to utilize the lean back to evade your opponent's jab when in the same fighting stance. It's a very deceptive technique because instead of raising your arms to block the punch or slipping to the outside of his striking arm, you simply lean back to make your opponent miss. It is important to not dramatically jerk your head backwards the instant you spot the jab because it will alert your opponent to your intentions. Instead of continuing forward with the jab, he will retract his punch, wait until you begin moving your body forward, and then capitalize on your awkward positioning with an alternate strike such as a cross. For the best results, you want to keep your face as close to your opponent's fist as possible to instill confidence in him and cause him to overextend his arm. It is also important not to get your stance too elongated. Remember, you only want to move far enough away to avoid your opponent's fist. Any more, and you will not be in a good position to launch a counterattack. There are two ways to use the lean back to launch a counter strike. The first method is to execute the lean back as you did in the previous sequence to evade your opponent's strike, and then follow his fist forward as he pulls it back into his stance and throw a strike of your own. This method is best employed when your opponent has a longer reach, and the key to being successful with it is keeping your face 1 or 2 inches away from his fist at all times. If you allow his fist to get ahead of you as he retracts it, there is a good chance you will walk into a secondary punch as you close the distance. The The second method is to throw a counter strike as you lean back, which is what I demonstrate in this sequence. This technique is best utilized when you have a longer reach than your opponent. The goal is to move your head far enough away that you miss your opponent's strike, but keep it close enough that you can land a strike of your own. To pull this technique off here, as my opponent's jab comes at me, I take a backward step with my rear foot and lean my head back. At the same time, I throw a counter jab. This is a very advanced technique because it requires you to have a very good sense of your opponent's range. If you are off by just a few inches, you'll most likely get hit. As a result, I recommend practicing this technique as much as possible and reserving it for the later rounds of a fight. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to use the lean back to evade your opponent's cross when in the same fighting stance. The movements involved are exactly the same as when evading your opponent's jab. As my opponent's fist comes at me, I take a backward step with my rear foot and lean my head back just far enough to cause him to miss. However, with the cross being a more powerful punch than the jab, you must have a very good sense of the length of your opponent's arms. Just as with the lean back off the jab, there are two ways to land a counter strike when using the lean back to evade the cross. If your opponent has a superior reach, you want to execute the basic lean back to cause him to miss, and then follow his fist as he pulls it back into his stance and throw a cross of your own. In this sequence, my reach is superior to my opponent's, so I throw the cross as I lean back. Again, the goal is to move your head far enough away to avoid your opponent's strike, but not so far that you can't land a counter strike. To pull the technique off here, as my opponent's fist comes at me, I take a small backward step with my rear foot and lean my head backward. At the same time, I rotate my body in a counterclockwise direction and throw a cross straight down the pipe. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to execute a lead sidestep slip, which is an excellent technique for not only evading your opponent's straight punches, but also setting up counter punches. To utilize this maneuver, I rotate my body in a clockwise direction, step my left foot further to the outside of my body, plant on the ball of my left foot, and then shift my weight towards my left side. The goal with this technique is to move your body away from your center line, causing your opponent to miss with his strike. In the next sequences, I will demonstrate how to employ this movement to evade actual strikes and set up counter strikes, but in the beginning, it is important that you get familiar with the basic movements involved. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to use the lead sidestep slip to evade your opponent's cross when in the same fighting stance. As my opponent's fist comes at me, I rotate my body in a clockwise direction, step my left foot further to the outside of my body, plant the ball of my left foot on the mat, and shift my upper body toward my left side. To ensure that I block his strike, I plant my left forearm against the outside of my opponent's striking arm and redirect it away from my head. As with all evasive techniques, the goal is to only move far enough to the outside of your center line to avoid your opponent's strike. If you lean too far back or take too large of a step to the outside of your body, you will jeopardize your balance, which not only makes you vulnerable to your opponent's secondary strikes, but also limits your ability to launch a counter-strike. In the next sequence, I demonstrate how to use this evasive maneuver to launch a counterattack, but when first learning this technique, it is important to focus exclusively on the defensive movements. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to use the lead sidestep to evade your opponent's cross and then counter with a left hook. Initially, all movements are the same as in the last technique. As my opponent's cross comes at me, I rotate my body in a clockwise direction, step my left foot to the outside of my body, plant on the ball of my left foot, and shift my weight to my left side. However, instead of placing my left arm on the outside of my opponent's cross, redirecting it away from me, I use the rotation of my body to throw a left hook over the top of his arm and to the side of his face. The nice part about this technique is that the rotation of your lead sidestep spring-loads your hips for the hook. However, it is very important that you execute the hook immediately after utilizing the evasive sidestep. The goal is to throw your hook over the top of your opponent's outstretched arm. If you delay, your opponent will pull his arm back into his stance and use it to protect the side of his head. In this section, I introduce you to the dirty boxing clinch, which is where you have one hand hooked around the back of your opponent's head and your opposite hand free to throw strikes. To begin, I demonstrate how to set up the dirty boxing clinch off strikes, and then how to set it up off your opponent's strikes. Next, I demonstrate how to use footwork to off-balance your opponent, making it easier to land an assortment of punches to both his body and head. Although the dirty boxing clinch is a position many fighters ignore, it is a necessary tool to have in your arsenal, especially when up against the fighter who is beating you with strikes on the outside. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to establish the dirty boxing clinch when your opponent evades your rear hook using a duck under, and then I show some of your striking options from the clinch. To begin this sequence, I throw a rear hook at my opponent's head. To avoid getting hit, he drops his level and rotates his body underneath the punch. Notice how missing the punch winds my hips in a counterclockwise direction. This sets me up to throw a lead hook, but instead of using my spring-loaded hips to deliver a punch to his head, I rotate in a clockwise direction and establish a left collar tie by hooking my left hand around the back of his head. Once I establish the collar tie, I immediately disrupt my opponent's balance by pulling his head downward. This can be done with just one hand, or, if your opponent is super strong, you can achieve this by securing double collar ties and using both hands to pull his head down. Either way, once you've lowered the elevation of his head, you have an excellent opportunity to land strikes using your free arm. Notice how you can attack his head, body, or even his legs. For the best results, you want to alter the location of your punches by going low and then high, or high and then low. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to block your opponent's rear hook and establish the dirty boxing clinch at the same time. To pull this off, the instant my opponent begins throwing his rear hook, I elevate my left arm to the inside of his right arm, step my lead foot forward, and wrap my left hand around the back of his head. Although it can be intimidating, the goal is to move into your opponent's strike to stuff it. If you wait until his strike is halfway to your face before moving in, you allow him to generate full power behind his punch. It is also extremely important to elevate your lead shoulder to protect your chin. Even when you time this move perfectly, there is still a good chance that your opponent's fist will loop over the top of your arm. If your chin isn't protected behind your lead shoulder, you might get rocked. Just as in the previous sequence, the instant you establish the dirty boxing clinch, you want to pull your opponent's head down to disrupt his balance and begin throwing strikes using your free hand. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to establish the dirty boxing clinch after blocking your opponent's rear hook using an outside block. Although stepping into the punch, as shown in the previous technique, is superior because it stuffs your opponent's punch and increases your chances of successfully establishing the dirty boxing clinch, this method is far safer. If your opponent has super fast punches or you don't have the footing needed to immediately step forward into the punch, I recommend using the outside block. To pull this technique off, as my opponent's hook comes at me, I elevate my left arm, place my left hand behind my left ear, and close off all space between my arm and the side of my head. This causes the power of my opponent's punch to be absorbed by my left forearm. While his arm is still extended, I slide my left arm down the length of his arm and hook my hand around the back of his head, establishing the dirty boxing clinch. In previous sequences, I demonstrated how to use your single collar tie to pull your opponent's head down directly from your stance. Although this will often be enough to disrupt his balance, a far better approach is to step to the outside of his body and pull his head down in a circular fashion. In order to maintain his balance, your opponent will be forced to take a step. While he is doing this, you have free rein to land strikes to his body and head. This technique is exactly the same as the previous one in that I block my opponent's rear hook using an outside block and then shoot my blocking arm forward to establish a collar tie. However, instead of stepping to the outside of his body and using my left collar tie to pull him off balance, I switch to a right collar tie, step to the outside of his body, and then push him off balance. I still force his head downward and in a circular direction, only now I am pushing rather than pulling. While my opponent is stepping to recover his base and balance, I now use my left arm to strike his body and head. Although you might find you like one method more than the other, it is important to master them both because it is a good way to keep your opponent guessing and throw off his defenses. In this sequence, my opponent throws a lead hook. Just as when he threw a rear hook, I utilize an outside block, only now I am doing so using my right arm instead of my left arm. Once I have absorbed the power of his punch on my forearm, I shoot my right arm down the length of his arm and wrap my hand around the back of his head, establishing the dirty boxing clinch. Just as in previous sequences, my goal is to off-balance my opponent to shatter his defense and set myself up for strikes. In this scenario, instead of stepping my rear leg to the outside of my opponent's lead leg, I step my lead leg to the outside of his rear leg. Once accomplished, I rotate my body in a clockwise direction and use my right collar tie to pull my opponent's head down and towards my right side. To throw his balance off even more, halfway through my rotation I switch my right collar tie to a left collar tie, and then use my control to push his head more toward my right side. Immediately after making this transition, I begin throwing strikes to his body and head using my right arm. A lot of fighters are masters at the dirty boxing clinch, especially wrestlers. If you are beating one of these opponents with punches on the outside, a lot of times they will grow desperate and simply step forward and reach for the back of your head with their rear arm. To defend against this technique, I will slip to the inside of their reaching hand and counter with a jab. It is important to mention that this technique is a little risky. As you learned earlier in this DVD, it is wise to always slip to the outside of your opponent's strike because it prevents you from getting hit with their opposite hand. However, when your opponent reaches for your head, the path of his hand usually resembles a hook more than a cross, which can make slipping to the outside difficult to accomplish. It's possible to bob and weave underneath his arm, but that takes time and will often allow your opponent to achieve his goal of closing the distance and tying you up in the clinch. I have found slipping to the inside of his reaching arm and then countering with a jab to be the most effective. It is very important to immediately launch your jab into your opponent's face to prevent him from following up his reach with a lead hook. The scenario presented here is the same as the last. I'm beating my opponent on the outside with punches, so he decides to step forward and reach for my head to establish the dirty boxing clinch. However, this time my opponent reaches with his lead hand instead of his rear hand. With trajectory on his arm resembling more of a lead hook than a jab, slipping to the outside of his arm can be difficult. Instead, I slip to the inside of his arm and immediately fire a right cross. This technique can be dangerous. If you slip to the inside of your opponent's punch and hesitate with the cross, your opponent will most likely throw a cross of his own. In order to be effective, you must slip your opponent's arm and throw the cross simultaneously. In this section, I offer a number of sparring and footwork drills you can execute to improve your technique. It is important to mention that you do not want to go all out with these drills. Instead, you want to focus on your form and timing. If it is a partner drill, keep your eyes locked on his midsection, watch his movement, and constantly be on the lookout for how you can acquire a dominant angle of attack by moving to the outside of his body. If it is a solo drill, imagine that you have a partner standing in front of you and execute your techniques just as you would on a real body. Although many of these techniques are intended to be executed slowly, you do not want to zone out. On the contrary, you want to focus your mind on every single movement of your body to make your techniques the most efficient.